Okay. Hello everyone again. Let's begin with the presentation of Cameron Brick. Sorry for the delay, but we have to wait a little bit to stop raining so we can be here and not wet at least. Cameron Brick is an assistant professor in the University of Amsterdam and is the director of the research group in environmental psychology. He studies how individual reacts to collective problems such as climate change. Probably you heard about it as well, an important topic and issue. He has published several papers, as most of the authors in the seminar, more than 100 papers. And I really liked something that I saw when I was making the introduction, preparing the introduction, that he received 2 awards. The 2022 Early Career Achievement. Probably my favorite one is the Rising Star of the Association of Psychological Science. So we can literally say that we have a star with us today. So today, after a complicated trip for arriving to Madrid, Cameron will be talking about psychological research on climate crisis. Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you very much. So just a couple words in Spanish. Resulta que yo viví aquí en Madrid por 9 meses, hace 20 años, y bueno, tengo curiosidad a ver si los sitios donde bebía siguen ahí. No sé. Pero si algunos quieren hablar de esos temas, pero en español también se puede. Okay. So my work is mostly about like you said, thank you for that very kind introduction, about why people are doing certain kinds of environmental behaviors, helpful and harmful behaviors. And the traditional way to do this is to look at a large scale where you ask about the frequency of doing all kinds of different behaviors and then maybe sum it all up into a composite. And we'll talk about different approaches for studying behavior. That's the underlying theme today. Lately, I'm actually getting very interested in how psychology interfaces with other fields. So if you look at this task report from the American Psychological Association, which is the biggest association of psychologists in the States, and it's very large, they take a strong position on the need for action on climate change at all levels, not just what we're studying, but how we run our organizations. And it's a very nice document, but it shows you how widespread this interest has become across the social sciences and in psychology in particular. And I put the sustainable development goals there because we'll return to this later in the talk, but I've been wondering whether the work that we're doing is actually useful for conservation and how we would know if that is the case. It's also true that going beyond studying whether people recycle or whether they change their diet, there's an increasing focus among psychologists on collective action, on activism, not just as a subject of research, but as something that psychologists and other scientists are doing themselves, because the scale of the crisis is such that we don't have a lot of time to react. So I don't know if everyone's been aware, but there's a surprising amount of even articles in journals, which is not the traditional way that activists make their point, but quite a lot of discussion about what we should be doing, whether we as scientists should also be taking these kinds of political stances. And just recently, this week even, the bottom one is from psychiatrists. So there's actually quite a lot of different fields reacting to climate. And there's also research on how this affects the public perception of scientists that take political positions. So for example, this is saying that some experiments have shown that making advocacy statements like we should definitely go for electrification more quickly to reduce the harmful effects of climate change, I say that here on the stage, does that affect my credibility as a basic scientist? And so far, at least, the results suggest no. The public expects us to take our expertise and to deliver what we understand is happening back to the public. That's our role. It should also be said that voluntary behavior won't be nearly enough. I arranged to take the train here. My train was canceled, So then I ended up flying, which is, you know, this happens. Okay, but it also happened to me a month ago. I was going to take the train to Switzerland to go to a meeting. There was a strike in the Netherlands and my train was canceled, and I flew to that too. So I think this is a great example of, even if you have someone who's really motivated, who's making certain consumer choices, it's not going to be sufficient. We also need to do these structural changes, which is one of the reasons why engaging in the political process is necessary. Another of the, I would say, leading figures in this area is Christian Nielsen. And he published this paper in Nature Energy, which I found very stimulating. And he talked about, it's basically all about how people that have more money are having an outsized influence on environmental outcomes, whether it's climate change or biodiversity, not just in what they buy, but also significant other areas like their influence in organizations and the way that they express their opinions in public. So we have done almost all of the work, I would say, in environmental psychology on consumerism, which is an important area, but there's all these other roles that people take. So this is like let's broaden out, let's recognize a little bit better. What does it matter if I at home in private go from, I don't know, 80% recycling to 90%? Maybe that's going to take me another hour a week, versus something I could do at work to change how, I don't know, transportation or catering is run in my university, something like that. This comes along with a focus, a much stronger focus on activism in the literature than you might expect. It's becoming a really big topic. So it's, I think, in part because it's part of this broader social conversation about what's happening, and we want to be connected to the real world, not just doing very esoteric work. When I was living in England, there were some very large protests around climate change, and this was interesting because it's not normal at these protests that this many people get arrested. The police in England, it's getting a little bit worse, but at least at that time, are pretty gentle with protesters that are well planned and nonviolent and everything. They don't want to arrest you. You sit down on a street and they come and they say, will you please move? And then if you move, they're not going to arrest you. So the fact that 1,000 people are getting arrested means that some people are engaging in this that really have never done this before. And this is grandmas and people who are not activists per se. And this for me was interesting. In the same kind of identity fusion way we heard about earlier, there seemed to be a transformation in how people are addressing their relationship to climate. And then the COVID hit, and all of that kind of got diminished. But I think that was a very interesting time. And as the effects of climate change become more visible, we're going to see more intersections between everyday people's psychology and climate-related topics. So we did some work on this. I'm going to just sprinkle empirical work throughout the talk. Me and Ben Kenward, who's a professor in Oxford Brookes in England. We did some work before, during, and after one of these protests to see if people's support for the fairly radical protest would change as opposed to before. So this isn't people who participated. This is a representative sample of the whole country. And to be honest, because much of the media is fairly, the daily sort of newspapers are fairly right-wing, I thought that coverage would be quite negative. It was. And that most people would then get a little bit more negative on the group because they block streets, they slow down economic activity, they create problems. But what we saw, well, before I show you what we saw, but you can see here that more people strongly oppose, that's in the dark red at the bottom, than strongly support. It's green at the top. But what happened during and after is actually there was a dramatic increase in support for these actions. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. But I think that this reflects that people are, I mean, if I had to speculate, people are already worried about these environmental problems and climate change. And when they see people who are also participating in public who are worried and saying, yes, we should do something about this, that is a kind of a relief. That's my speculation. We're also doing some work Europe-wide on large open data sets, and I'll tell you where to find these at the end of the talk. In part because we don't always have enough money to do the research to collect all these giant samples ourselves. So we've been using some of these free data sets, and actually it's very high quality data. It's much higher quality than what I would have collected myself, in that they're doing a lot of these over telephone interviews with people that may or may not have internet access. Like they're more representative, they have survey weighting, all this stuff, okay. One of the techniques we used recently was called latent class analysis, which is a kind of a marketing segmentation to try and determine different groups of people. And it doesn't always work. So there may not have been 4 groups, there could have been 10, or it could have just not converged and then the model doesn't fit that well, or, but it turned out it did fit fairly well, and we saw evidence for 4 different types of people in how they relate to the beliefs and attitudes around climate change. This is in Europe, so I think it's 22 countries plus Israel. And you can see that it goes from more engaged to less engaged, but one key difference from the US has another group on the right that's called dismissive. They're kind of deniers. They're saying climate change is not happening, and it's a conspiracy, and I don't know what. But we didn't see evidence for a large group that was distinguished by that in Europe. So although there are people who are disagreeing with its premises, it's not like a focal group in the same way. And you can see the biggest group is indifferent. So this is people that, they don't disagree that it's happening, they're just not seeing a lot of relationship to their daily life. This is the sort of data that makes up one of those segmentations. I'm only showing you some of the items here. There's just 2 items. Do you think the world's climate is changing, and what is causing climate change? But if you look at the upper right, you'll see that do you think the world's climate is changing? Even in the doubtful group, they're overwhelmingly saying that it's changing. So Europe knows that something is happening. Even the people way over on the doubtful side. So it's not really correct to characterize them as saying that they're climate deniers, at least not on a large scale. But they don't totally know why it's happening, as you can see in the lower right. I just wanted to highlight Spain for you here in the large-scale data that we have about what the proportion of these different groups are in different countries. It's not really all that different. It's kind of near the median, maybe a little bit more engaged and pessimistic than relative to the other groups, but not so different. In addition to this sort of large-scale segmentation work, we also do some more classic psychometric development, like trying to measure environmental attitudes. Aaron and I got into this project because we were reading the old scales of environmental attitudes. This is how you feel about your relationship to nature and the environment. And they really sounded very politically left-wing to us, very progressive. One of the items from the connectedness to nature scale, that's one of the classic ones, is like a tree is part of the forest, I feel part of the broader natural world. And I hear that and I think, hippie. You can also think, yeah, okay, I'm part of the natural world. But what we wanted to do was develop a scale that maybe didn't signal political identity quite so much. So we started with the premise of different kind of moral violations, and then we wrote items that violated those morals. And then we tried to make it more maybe discriminating and useful for political conservatives or people on the right. So that was the goal. We validated this scale using item analysis, and I hadn't done this before. This graph is a little bit confusing, but our scale is on the left, and then 2 other classic scales, the connectedness to nature scale and the new environmental paradigm. And top to bottom shows you where on the spectrum of sort of you're low or you're high on the scale do the items cover. And it turns out that both of the other scales have better coverage on the high end. So they better distinguish, let's say, a medium-high environmental attitude from a very high environmental attitude. And that would make sense from the intuitive read that they were sort of left-leaning. Our items are a little bit more spread out. That's good. They're a little bit more on the low environmental attitude. That's what we intended. They don't have very much coverage on high. Okay, that's not as good, I guess. But what we saw is that it had similar psychometric properties, and we recommend the scale for populations that, let's say, aren't university students and maybe aren't so left. This is part of a broader sort of history of working on environmental psychology projects in my group, and I just wanted to explain that at the beginning I started on the far left. Let's predict pro-environmental behavior with some personality trait mediated by some environmental attitude, like basically the most complex model. And then over time I've gotten narrower and narrower. Like, I don't even totally know what pro-environmental behavior is anymore. So how do I mediate it through something and predict it from something else? So I'm getting a little bit more specific into particular contexts and behaviors now. My dissertation was about how people react when you watch them. Do they end up engaging in more pro-environmental behaviors or fewer? And our work suggested that identity is the critical information there. If you see yourself as an environmentalist, then you tend to do more when you're being watched, and the reverse, you'll do less. And this is not so amazing. It's just the observation that classic social psychology, we want to feel good about ourselves. We signal to others with our groups, who we want to present, that this also applies to pro-environmental behaviors. But some of them are much more visible, like in the upper right, bringing reusable bags to the grocery. And some of them are much less visible, like water use in your home. Your friends, your family, your coworkers may not know how long your showers are. So some behaviors are more private and some more public. And we show that this visibility affects whether people are trying to signal certain identities with the behavior. The low visible ones are less reactive to identity and that sort of thing. This leads me back to another one of the large-scale European projects we did. This is one of our, actually, bachelor's students did a thesis on this. It was exemplary. We wrote it up. It took several years to get it into shape, as would be typical with this sort of thing. And we just published this recently, and it's a replication which is multi-country, so in that sense, it aligns very well with, let's hear from Roy's talk later about whether those methods make sense. But I don't know how many of you have heard of this cultural cognition theory, but it's a set of predictions about how people's beliefs are altered by their social commitments, let's say, and what groups they see themselves as part of, or how they see themselves. So that you could predict climate change belief from some of these cultural level variables. These are the kind of items we used. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see that they load fairly well with each other. We did this with the European Social Survey, so we didn't get to write these questions. The alignment between the items and our theory isn't the best. That's the weaker part of this, I would say. But what we see is that when predicting these three outcomes, beliefs, policy preferences around the environment, and pro-environmental actions, these scales, which are the top two here, hierarchy, egalitarianism, and individualism, communitarianism, don't predict them very well. That's basically the outcome. They do, but they don't add very much story. So we say it's not adding a lot of variance to talk about these variables. This isn't the key determinant of why people believe in climate change or take personal action. I mentioned that the sort of underlying theme today is behavior. And one of the key problems in our literature is that the self-reported pro-environmental behaviors don't correlate very much with objective, observed behaviors when both are assessed in the same studies. There haven't been very many of these studies, and they were summarized in a meta-analysis just once. There definitely needs to be another one. But in this one, they found that they shared 21% of their variance. And I share this figure on the right to say, even if you have a pro-environmental behavior scale that has excellent psychometric properties, whether it's very reliable and all the items load together and whatever, it still might not be measuring the thing that you wanted it to. That's a separate question. I guess it depends on whether you want, when you're developing these scales, to measure some aspect of how people think about their own environmental actions, keep it very psychological, or whether you want to be measuring something about their conservation, about how they're affecting the actual environment. It depends on the research program. We wrote a comment, Christian, I, and some others, just last year, I guess, where we laid out this problem about how many of the scales don't really associate that well with the actual behaviors that are being inferred. And we recommended 5 steps to build better theories in this sub-area. This really ticked some people off, actually, suggesting that the last decades of work weren't that effective. So there were some very high-profile people who wrote a response to our comment. It was like a lot of early career people like me writing this criticism, and then a bunch of very senior people who wrote a comment disagreeing with us. It was an interesting experience. But I think that I just want to highlight number 3 here. Something that psychologists in my area don't tend to do very well is consider non-psychological determinants. We tend to start with something like the theory of planned behavior and then say, well, should we study norms, or should we study attitudes today, or maybe self-efficacy? But like, that's the whole span. You won't include other kinds of physical features of the environment, contextual features, or demographic considerations. So if we really want to understand why people are behaving in a certain way, we need to also include those behaviors. To hammer this point home, I want to share with you one of our most recent papers. And we're continuing this question about how we should think about and measure pro-environmental behavior. Classically, the approach has been that you want to take intention behavior gap and then make it smaller. You want to show in some study, look, my intentions predicted behaviors at a really high effect. Like, this is the smallest gap possible. But if you do that and you don't pay a lot of attention to the validity of the behavior that you're measuring, you're going to end up with the behavior sliding towards the intention in the way that you measured it. Let me explain. The classic environmental psychology approach is to measure the behaviors on the same sort of scales that you measure the intentions and the attitudes and the norms and all the rest of it, like a Likert style scale, agree, disagree, or maybe it's frequency, like never, rarely, sometimes, those sorts of responses, because it leads to easier scale management. And we want behaviors that are done by a wide group of people and that form a normal distribution, because then we can have our most convenient statistical experience. The alternative, way on the other end, and I think both of these approaches are valuable for different kinds of research questions. The alternative is to measure actual environmental impact. And you'll know that you're measuring impact because you will no longer have units that are based on psychology. You'll have units that are in liters of water, kilowatt hours of energy, kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a powerful transition because it allows you to connect with things like the Sustainable Development Goals or economists or a lot of people who are not psychologists don't particularly care about our beta values of how self-efficacy has this kind of effect. It opens up quite a lot of questions if you consider that these outcomes might be different. What we did is we took 4 countries, 3 in Europe and the US, and we asked what predicts pro-environmental behavior around clothing. And so we included clothing purchasing, we included how much you maintain a certain stock of clothing, and we included the washing and drying. Okay, so I'm mentioning some physical processes there, the greenhouse gas emissions from purchasing and washing, and that's the life cycle assessment, which is a technique from ecology and environmental science. But we also measured their clothing behavior on a classic scale, the environmental apparel scale, which is agreement or disagreement with items like, I buy clothing made from organically grown natural fibers. We included a whole mess of psychological predictors, all the big ones you know and love, goals and self-efficacy and attitudes and intentions. And the idea here was to have a really wide breadth so that we could have some characterization of how well these different features predict each outcome. What you're seeing here is a graph where every individual dot is one of these psychological predictors. And on the far left here, the only part you're seeing, this is the strength of the correlation between the predictor and the environmental apparel scale. So this is the classic self-report environmental behavior measure, and you can see that it's well predicted by these psychological predictors. So this is like exactly the kind of result that we've been talking about for a long time in the field. But if you look at the actual impact of greenhouse gas emissions based on people's clothing-related behaviors, the psychological predictors don't seem to predict them very much. Maybe a little bit, but trivially, I would say. This is a kind of a disturbing result. It would suggest that when we think we know what is causing people to behave in environmentally significant ways, that what we've actually captured is something more about how they're thinking about their own pro-environmental behavior and not so much their actual impact, which could be fine unless the point was to study impact, in which case it is not fine. In fact, it's even worse than that. If you look over here on the left, it says clothing purchase, which is the thing that drives the greenhouse gas emissions the most. Clothing purchase on the y-axis and the classic environmental scale on the x-axis. And you'll see that as people report that they're getting more and more pro-environmental on the classic scale, they're actually buying more clothing. So this does make some sense if you think about demographics. It's going to be the people who are higher education, like we heard earlier from Karen, that know not to buy into certain kinds of ridiculous conspiracy theories. Well, they also know more about the environment. They know more about their impact. They're going to be more concerned. And they're going to get involved and maybe buy organic. But they also have more income, and they're going to maybe consume more than someone who has less income. Not necessarily for, environmental reasons, but the impact is the same. So what I would suggest is that we need more studies like this, where we see what are the psychological predictors that are explaining pro-environmental behaviors. This is just clothing, and it's just 4 countries. And also it's just one environmental outcome. You could have looked at water use, and then jeans would be very important, right? Because they use a lot of water compared to other fabrics. So there's a lot of questions to dig into here. And the question for my group, which I don't know the answer to, is when intentions are, decouple from impact, when they're really different, which of the outcomes should we be prioritizing for testing our main theories? On that note, I want to share with you the most effortful study we ever did. It's not nearly as hard as going into prisons and talking to terrorists. That is really impressive work. But I will say this took us 6 years from start to publication, and I can see why we mostly don't do this kind of work. I mean, I can see why we try and collect online samples instead. It takes ridiculously long. California is experiencing a terrible drought. It was in 2015. Believe it or not, it has continued in the last 7 years, so it's still terrible. And we want to help people save water in their households. And it turns out that these water managers, the people that actually deliver the water to houses, local officials, don't have a lot of options. They can't easily raise the price of the water. That really makes people angry. But they are communicating with the public, so maybe we can communicate in a more effective way. We used as the foundation for this work the information, motivation, behavioral skills model, which predicts change as a function of these elements. I like this model. It's also good for teaching. It's sort of bite-sized. There are a lot of models in psychology that look like this, the Fazio's mode model or the theory of planned behavior. They're all kind of related. This one has been a good fit for some of our designs. And we constructed different kinds of messages that we mailed out to 10,000 houses. So these messages, they had information about the problem. It says Lake Kachuma is below 33%. So that's like, oh, there's a problem. Or they had motivation on them. There's like, there are others making changes, a social norms kind of prompt. And they had behavioral skills. So they had some or all of these components, and that's what the experiment was. No treatment, treatment with some of these, treatment with other components. And then we measured their actual household water use, not by self-report, but through the water utility. And that's why this study took so long, because they really don't trust you very quickly, and then maybe the person you were working with leaves, and it all gets very complicated. This is the main result of the study. You can see that the control condition in red is declining over the period of the study. That's because this was in the fall, like in November, December, and the more it rains, the less people irrigate outside, which really strongly reduces their household water use. So that's why your use is going down for everyone over the period of the study. That's normal. But any combination that we tested, information and behavioral skills or information and motivation, they were all pretty similar. They all reduced water use in the households. Most of the effect lasted about a month, 1 to 2 months. And the effect was about 2,000 liters per household for sending them this postcard. It's pretty cheap to send a postcard. So this was a success in that it was cost effective. It had a large effect even if it was temporary. And it was more effective for households with higher use. So we were very pleased with that result. I mean, it might not have worked. And then we say to the district, look, you can use these kinds of components when you message based on our advice. We extended this work to a systematic review where we looked at all of the household conservation work on water and then filtered it through this IMB model to try and explain something about those studies. You can see that one. And the last empirical work I want to talk about is about a whole new category of consequential laboratory tasks where people are making repeated decisions about environmental damage. So this is Florian Lange. He came up with 2 of the new methods, actually. And just to show you an example, you could be in a laboratory and you have a set of choices to make. And some of the choices you make will make lights go on. You'll see the lights, and it tells you that they're producing carbon dioxide, and that's producing greenhouse gases, basically. So that's bad. And then where you're sitting, you actually see the lights go on. So this is true. It's a fairly trivial amount of pollution, but it is actually happening. And what they're doing is making repeated decisions where there's some cost. Like, okay, I can choose to not put the lights on, but then I have to sit in the experimental task and do nothing for 30 more seconds, which is boring. Everyone wants to leave earlier. If I make you make this decision 20 times, maybe you start showing your willingness, your individual willingness to do environmental damage for your own convenience. What I really like about these tasks is that because they allow you to measure a sort of a tendency at high reliability across many trials, and in situ, right then, you can do manipulations on them. So imagine you show them some message, measure their pro-environmental behavior right afterwards. You don't have to rely on self-report. I promised I would show you a resource of open psychological data sets, especially for the students. I cannot more highly recommend. These are underused, free, and sometimes enormous amounts of data. And you can email me if you don't remember to look this up. The last thing is that we are launching a new journal in the environmental psychology space. I think in response really to 3 main pillars. One is the for-profit publishing system, one is reporting transparency, and one is diversity. But I want to just give a quick plug for it because this is the first community journal in this space, I think. It's free for authors and reviewers. Reviewers. It's free for authors and readers. So it's open access, all of it, and no fees. It's funded through this Leibniz Institute, which runs 10 or 15 other journals. And we have quite high reporting requirements. It doesn't mean that all the studies need to be perfect. It's more about transparency, about how did you arrive at that design, and are you showing all the parts of it? And we have a whole guide for you. So hopefully that's not a barrier, just letting you know that it's a focus. And we're trying to spread out a little bit more around the world in terms of the staff that are working there and the opportunities for getting involved around the globe. I'm going to be associate editor of some of the submissions, like the registered reports. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time for questions.
Really nice talk. I really like the idea of, and this is a nice audience to bring this message to, is to include non-psychological measures. And I was wondering, isn't it possible, because psychologists are very good at scale construction, psychometrics, etc. Oh, sorry. Yeah, psychologists are very, just at the right moment, psychologists are very good at scale construction, psychometrics, etc. Creativity sometimes in all sorts of things. Isn't it, what would you recommend if you were to predict those specific behaviors that are often based on habit, I guess, they are somewhat costly? What kind of measurement do you think would really outperform, so to speak, and also have really surplus value regarding the measures that we now have? Do you have any recommendations?
Thank you. Thank you for that comment and question. It's a tough one. I think my advice would be in that 2021 commentary. We say first pick a specific behavior in a specific context. Then try and characterize what is going on in that context, and you'll come up with some non-psychology things that are happening. You know, like when I lived in the US, I had a car and I drove everywhere. Is that explained by my environmental attitude? Because now I live in Amsterdam and I don't drive anywhere. It's better explained by the local infrastructure. So I think the first thing is to look at that specific behavior in that context, but it's going to vary. And I don't think there is any universal thing that is pro-environmental behavior. We're going to end up with different types of things that have different functional causes, but we're not there yet. I await that integration. Yeah. Thanks.
Hola. Have you noticed among those who are engaged in pro-environmental behavior any kind of eco-anxiety?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear very well.
Tío, nadie me oye.
What did it say?
Have you noticed among those who are engaged in pro-environmental behavior any kind of eco-anxiety, which is a new term for an anxiety related to climate change issues?
Have I noticed climate anxiety in the people?
In those who are engaged.
Yes, so there's some very important work here, and I would say personally, yes, I have run into this. I haven't studied it in the lab, but it's kind of contradictory, I would say, because there are some people when they're learning about the scale of the crisis and how large it is that get very anxious and have negative emotions as a result, and I did, and that makes sense. But it's also true that if you go from, I don't know, your old life where you didn't know there was a problem, and then you now arrive at, now I'm working with people who also want to make the world a better place, those social relationships and that process of doing meaningful work is deeply fulfilling, and it fulfills other of our fundamental motivations to belong, and so I see that also. So it's kind of both, I would say. Last
question. So you were asking about attitudes such as recycling, maybe increasing from 80% to 90% doesn't make that much of a difference. And you were saying also some of these cannot be solved voluntarily. So I'm thinking, I'm no expert, but I've read, for example, eating less meat has a larger impact. It's one of the things that at the individual level has a larger impact. And then probably things like going to policies such as carbon taxing would have a larger impact, but this needs political support. So I wonder whether you can comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think that's exactly the sort of question that you arrive at when you start thinking of in the impact focus. And indeed for I'd say the educated class that we're having this conversation in, it's generally reducing air travel and reducing red meat consumption are the easiest wins. Doesn't mean go to 0 tomorrow. It just means if you do a little bit less, that's way more effective than recycling a piece of paper or something like that. The focus on political processes is, I think, right, in that they could be potentially a very high impact, but it isn't just, like it leads you towards policy preferences and then, I don't know, national carbon tax, that sort of thing. But it could also be, like, why do people get engaged with those different roles? I showed you the Nielsen 5 roles, and it's like organization and citizen. You could study those processes. It's not all about voting in very large groups. And those I would also call, in a sense, a little bit political, this sort of citizenship behaviors. And the last thing is, environmentalists have been talking about this carbon tax nonstop for almost 30 years, and it basically hasn't happened anywhere. It can't seem to be passed. It doesn't matter how hypothetically effective it is if it's not feasible. So I think if Christian were here, he would tell us we need to keep always what is feasible in mind. And if it's the second best solution, but it's feasible, then we should work hard on implementing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. Well, our next presenter is a colleague from Autónoma University of Madrid, Pablo Brinol. He is also a regular visiting scholar at Ohio State University, and his research focuses on the study of psychological mechanisms and underlying attitudes and persuasion. Pablo has produced a huge amount of paper as well. He is a prolific author, really well known by the researchers in the field. And today his presentation will be about self-validation theory and its implications for the interventions. Thank you, Pablo.
Hello? Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Alfredo. And thank you both, Alfredo and Mirko, for putting this together. I don't know. I thought that you were there like a second ago. Maybe like Bin Laden, you can be alive and dead at the same time. Two places at the same time. Thank you both for putting this together. Thank you also for Ana and the department and the Spanish Journal and all the institutions that made it possible. I didn't know that this is the 9th edition. That is quite impressive. Congratulations on that. I know what it goes into international meetings, and it's a lot of work. So congratulations to the department for that initiative. I would like to begin by saying that I'm close to a food coma right now. So it makes me think that I'm not alone in that department. So I'll try to be energetic about this. This is the final talk, and I'll try to keep the energy level high if I can. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about self-validation. That is a process that is metacognitive in nature, which involves thinking about your own thoughts. And so that is an image that was trying to capture that idea. And the talk is organized around 6 ideas. One is going to be about what people perceive to be valid when it comes to mind. So it's perceived validity of your own thoughts. What kinds of validities are important in those metacognitive perceptions. We are going to talk about the other side of the coin, which is when you doubt your own thoughts, invalidation. We are going to talk about moderation of that process and some of the outcomes that are produced by this mechanism. And also, the last postulate has to do with meaning. So I made a selection of examples that are particularly relevant for positive psychology because we are writing a review on that particular context. But there are many other examples going from pro-social behavior, even environmental attitudes and environmental behaviors, anti-social behaviors, aggressive behavior. We have even examples that have to do with identity fusion. All of that can be found here, which is a review that just came out in Psych Review where you can find all the details. So I just made a selection to illustrate each of those 6 points with 1 or 2 empirical highlights, but there is more to it, and there are many examples that you can find here. So feel free to go into this review or to my webpage to find the details. So I'll try to focus on the big picture. Again, trying to be energetic, trying to be broad. Let's see how that goes. Okay, so here is the first idea, which is like thoughts become more consequential in guiding both judgments and actions as their perceived validity that can come from a bunch of origins, including incidental factors, is increased. So this may read as a truism. It's like, of course, if you perceive a thought to be valid, you are more likely to act on that thought. So that thought is going to be more consequential in guiding outcomes when you think it's a valid thought. Yeah, sure. And you can have an illustration of how that looks in terms of empirical evidence. So if you have a perception of high validity, that would be here, high validity, and you have positive thoughts, so that is going to lead you to a positive action overall. And if you have perceptions of high validity, but you happen to have a negative thought in mind at the time, that is going to lead to a negative outcome. If I can find the pointer here. So the idea here that whatever you have in mind is going to become more consequential, more impactful, is going to magnify the consequences when you perceive that mental construct to be a valid one. So far, so good. You have a positive thought, you trust that thought, then you act on it, and it's going to lead to a positive outcome. Now you have a negative thought coming to mind, and then you think it's a valid negative thought to have, and then you go and do something wrong, something bad. So you polarize the impact of both positive and negative thoughts. So again, so far, it may feel almost like common sense that you use the thoughts that you consider valid. And of course, some thoughts are rated to be valid based on merits. But as you saw earlier today, Cameron was just presenting evidence that people believe that there are some lizards among us, and even though that doesn't feel like a rational thought to have, but people believe that can be true, and they behave accordingly. So you can have thoughts that are rational, and you doubt them, and you can have thoughts that may actually not be grounded on reality. They actually are irrational thoughts to have, and still perceive them to be valid. So there is a dissociation here between the content of the thought or the merits of the thoughts and whether you perceive those thoughts to be valid or not. So in fact, the earlier research in this metacognitive process was focusing on factors like, perceived knowledge, perceived expertise, elaboration. So you will use your thoughts more when you have knowledge about the thought or about the topic for which you are generating the thoughts. So that makes perfect sense. You are an expert, you know a lot about something, you are more likely to trust the thoughts that you have in that domain. But, and here's the first twist, a little bit counterintuitive. It turns out that it's not only those content-based variables that are capable of increasing thought use, but you have all kinds of other variables that are also capable of doing that magnification effect over thinking. And they are trivial to the content of the thoughts, or they are at least unrelated. So something as simple, and this is a study from my dissertation, something as simple as having people move their head up and down, and again, with the cover story that they are testing the quality of headphones, so just having people move their heads up and down, a behavior that is associated with showing agreement, compared to those that are induced to move their head from side to side horizontally, just by having an induction in this case, it's an embodiment induction in which people are randomly assigned to move their heads up and down or side to side, that is capable of polarizing thoughts, both positive and negative, even though the thoughts has nothing to do with the headphones they are testing or with anything. So that would be true for feeling powerful, for using high or low pitch, or when you feel that the situation matches the kind of person that you are. So, of course, thoughts are translated into action when you think you know a lot about them, but also when you are engaged in a behavior as mundane, as trivial as just moving your head up and down, a behavior that is associated with agreement. Therefore, you are showing almost like agreement to your own thoughts, and you use them. Keep in mind that you use both your positive thoughts, but also your negative thoughts. Whatever the thoughts that you happen to have in mind will be translated into action. So something that is a positive behavior, usually associated with agreement and with getting along and so forth, can lead you to a very bad outcome if what you are noting is at your negative thoughts. Now you are sure they are true, you are more likely to act on them, and then you engage in either violent behavior or aggression or whatever negative outcome may follow. So this is the first idea. People use their thoughts more when they are sure that they are right, but that perception of validity doesn't have to come from knowledge, expertise, or reality. It just can come from anything that will give you a temporal sense of rightness or confidence, or as you will see in a second, something that makes you feel good. So that's like the first idea. Here you have an example. It's a 2x2. We randomly people to generate either positive or negative thoughts. These are MBA students that are about to enter the job market, and they are preparing for all those interviews. So they are randomly assigned to either think of their strengths in entering the job market or their weaknesses. So we manipulate the direction of the thoughts about the self. And then we had them type in those thoughts in the computer, either again, their strengths or their weaknesses are now typed in the computer, having them in a confident posture or a doubtful posture. And we gave them a cover story for why we want them to have that posture during the task. And then we measure a bunch of things, including self-esteem, but also how much money, how much income they thought they were going to make in their first job, and a bunch of other things. And what they found, and I thought this was split in two, so I can see that you saw what we found for all this time. You see, it was supposed to appear now, but it's there. So what we found is what we were predicting from the self-validation point of view. So for those that were entering their thoughts in a confident posture, the direction of those thoughts made a difference in their overall judgment. But for the ones that were entering their thoughts in a doubtful posture, then it didn't matter whether they were thinking positive or negative thoughts. It didn't translate into judgments. So another way to unpack this two-way interaction is like if you are having positive thoughts about all the good things that you have as a job candidate and you are going to make it, this is going to be great, and then you feel confident about it, a feeling of confidence that is coming from a body posture that has been induced in the lab. If you misattribute the confidence that is being generated by the posture to the positive thoughts, then fine. Those positive thoughts become reality. Now, if the confidence that comes from that posture is misattributed to a negative thought that you have, so you're having all these worries about not doing well, and all of a sudden you feel there is some truth, some perceived truth to those fears and worries, then you are freeze. And that's what we found. So positive thoughts polarize, leading to positive outcomes, and negative thoughts polarize too. And even though from the point of view of self-validation, this is a kind of like now like a traditional outcome. It looks like a classic interaction for us, but this is quite paradoxical. First, if you only look at the thoughts, you will see almost nothing. There's a small main effect of positive versus negative thoughts, but here there is an interaction between the mind and the body. If you only look at the body, as it has been the case with some literature in environment that only look at the outcome associated with the bodily response, then you will not see much. So it's when you take into consideration how body and mind interact with each other that you can make the prediction. And a paradoxical case here. So again, it is ironic that a confident posture can make you feel very low in self-esteem and very low in your prospects when that confidence is misattributed to a negative thought. So that is a reversal of what will be an intuitive outcome. And also, here you have an interesting condition, the double negative here, in which you have a negative thought to begin with. You are thinking about your worries and fears and all of that, and all of a sudden, the experimenter puts you in a bad posture, in a negative posture, in a doubtful posture. And all of a sudden, because you feel doubts about your negative thoughts, you don't act on those anymore. So two negative inductions are associated with a positive outcome when you interpret those from the self-validation point of view. So this metacognitive process is quite useful in making predictions a priori and in reversing a bunch of normal effects and leading to paradoxical outcomes. So here is how the model looks like. And so we have the beliefs, thoughts, ideas, goals. They are translated into attitude, judgments, intentions, and those intentions are translated into behavior, more so when you perceive those mental constructs to be associated with high validity. And again, that validity doesn't have to come from the right place. They can come from anywhere that is associated with a subjective perception of validity. And we have found that to be the case for a bunch of embodiment studies, but there are also studies using other variables, and I'll give you a hint of some of those through the talk. So here is what we are doing now. So for each of the 6 ideas, I'm going to give you an overview of what we are doing now. So because this is about, I think that's the running theme for the conference, is what is new, what is different, where are we going from here. And so I'm going to be highlighting what is forthcoming, what is new, what we are doing now, therefore what it will be published hopefully in the future. So we are now trying to validate expectations in a number of domains, quite unique thoughts such as secrets. We are moderating we have people completing all kinds of scales, and just by adding one single item, asking how sure are you of the responses you just gave, just one single item is capable of increasing predictive validity of every single scale, including things like identity fusion. Just one item, asking how sure are you of your responses, and then you are significantly predicting more sacrifices with the identity fusion scale. So, of course, if you ask people how sure they are in their beliefs about conspiracy theories, the prediction will be that they are more likely to add on them, and so forth and so on. So those are the thoughts that we are trying to moderate the impact of those thoughts on different outcomes. Now we have different validating variables: gratitude, forgiveness, kindness, secure attachment, and others. And of course, we are studying this not only in isolation, but in combination. So trying to put people in the right situation. So again, ironically, for example, some of the work that David has done is like if you have a person that is highly aggressive, so score highs in trait aggressiveness, and then you put them in the right situation for them, which is playing a violent video game from the point of view of an agent. So again, think of this: an aggressive person in a violent situation, and there is a feed that gives them a feeling of certainty that can be misattributed to any thought, including positive thoughts about others. Therefore, you have a bad person in a bad situation helping others, to give you an example. And that's because they feel good about the situation in which they are. They feel things are going well, it's right, and that they misattribute that feeling of confidence to whatever it happens to be in their mind, which again, we can manipulate those initial thoughts to be about helping people, to give a counterintuitive example. So that's the first idea. Second idea is that we can use our thoughts not only because we perceive them to be right, to be valid, but also because we just feel good about them. In fact, not even good about them. I just feel good, and I can misattribute that pleasantness to anything that happens to be in mine. And we have distinguished those two things, so this would be an example of cognitive validation. You have positive or negative thoughts, then people find out after generating those thoughts that that the message came from a credible or non-credible source, and there is more thought use in the high than the low credible source. So far, so good. But here is an example of this second kind of validation that has to do with feeling good at the time. So we have people generating either positive or negative thoughts, and then we have them holding a pen. They are randomly assigned to hold a pen here in their mouth. That is a facial expression that forces you to use the same muscles that are involved in smiling. Smiling, we borrowed this from our friend Fitztrack. And then the control group, in this case, they were holding the pen in different positions that were not associated with feeling good. And what we found is that just by having people, again, subtle induction of a facial expression associated with a positive mood, then they use their thoughts more. And one more time, they use their thoughts regardless of whether those thoughts are positive or negative. So in other words, if you are having a negative thought, the last thing you want to do with your body is engage in positive actions like smiling, because then you are going to add on that negative thought because you feel good about it, and that pleasantness is misattributed to that negative thought that was induced there. So you can use your thoughts either because they are right or they are perceived to be right, or you can use your thoughts because you happen to be feeling good at the time. For most of the variables that we're studying in the first generation of self-validation research, those two things are confound together. So for example, the powerful posture is something that is associated with feelings of power and feeling empowered and feeling confident, but it's also like a pleasant posture compared to this one. So they are both acting in both directions. Happiness is an emotion that is associated with both a pleasantness appraisal, but also with a confident appraisal. So both forces are working in the same direction. They are joint efforts to help you use your thoughts. But there are some other emotions for which the pleasantness appraisal and the confident appraisal are dissociated. For example, hope is an emotion that is pleasant, but is associated with uncertainty. Whereas helplessness is the opposite. It's relatively more unpleasant, but most people think there is nothing they can do about it. They learn that there's very little they can do. So it's unpleasant, but relatively more certain. And what we have been doing with Maria and Blanca and other colleagues from the lab is trying to isolate each of those components because they make opposite predictions about whether you are going to be using your thoughts because you feel good or whether you are going to be using your thoughts because you think they are right. Here is an example of how this looks. So you focus on perceptions of validity, so the cognitive, what we call cognitive validation. Then, ironically, people are using their thoughts more when they are in a helplessness than in a hope state. And that is because helplessness relative to hope is more certain. There is more uncertainty in hope than there is in helplessness. But it's paradoxical. You are using your thoughts more, including positive thoughts, of course. And the opposite is true for the affective validation side of things. So when you focus on how good you feel, then there is more thought usage for hope than for hopelessness. And again, more thought use is true for both positive and negative thoughts. So we have seen the same pattern trying to dissociate. So again, one more time, we are in postulate 2, affective and cognitive validation. In most cases, they work together. These are unique exceptions in which they can be, those two things can be separated. Here is another case, awe, overwhelmed by awe. So that is associated with uncertainty from the point of view of the confidence appraisal, but it's a relatively pleasant experience compared to anger. Anger is an unpleasant emotion for most people, not for all, but for most people, it's a relatively more negative emotion than awe, but it's a very certain emotion. When you are angry, you know what's happening, and you are actually motivated to do something about it because you don't want to be in that state. So here we found the same thing. This is the earlier JPSP on this paradigm, trying to dissociate pleasantness and confidence in these mixed emotions, that they have those two things not working in the same direction. So there is more thought use for anger than awe when people are focused on the confidence that's associated with emotion. But when you focus people on whether they feel good or bad, then there is more thought usage with awe compared to anger. So I think you got the paradigm. We have done this a number of times. This is comparing surprise versus disgust. Surprise is relatively more pleasant than disgust, but it's also associated with being proved wrong. So you were waiting for something and then your expectation is violated, therefore you are wrong, therefore you are doubtful. So surprise is a more doubtful emotion from the point of view of the uncertainty appraisal compared to disgust that is unpleasant, but again, most of the time it's more certain than surprise. And we were able to dissociate that. Here, one more time, when you focus on how good you feel, surprise outperforms disgust, but when you focus on perceptions of validity, cognitive validity, then you start using your thoughts more for disgust than surprise. And that is true for both positive and negative thoughts. So we've been doing a lot of work on this, and we are now exploring new emotions. Greg Lamprinakos and Maria Safraki, they are working on a paradigm that compares curiosity and boredom, admiration and disdain. Again, curiosity is associated with pleasantness, but with not knowing. Therefore, it's uncertain from the point of view of that appraisal, whereas boredom is more unpleasant. But people know they are bored, so it's associated with knowing more than curiosity. And that is true for the comparison between those other emotions. We are trying to dissociate both the cognitive route to thought use and the affective route to thought usage. It doesn't have to be emotions, wishful thinking, pleasant, positive, but it's not likely to be true. So there is not an emotion there, but the confident and the pleasant net appraisals are dissociated. Same thing with realistic pessimism. It doesn't feel as pleasant as wishful thinking, but usually you are pretty sure about what to expect in terms of the cost of life, that is, or something like that. So it's not pleasant, but it's true. So we can dissociate tip of the tongue. You know something that at the same time you don't know now. So you can isolate each of those components and trying to validate thoughts or invalidate thoughts by separating that. And of course, people may differ in what appraisal dominates by default, and there are individual differences, and I'm sure that there are probably cultural differences that we may hear about tomorrow. So. So far, so good. I don't know. Is there any time control here?
We lost it, so I'm not going to find it. So take it easy, relax.
3 hours left. We're good. Thank you. I cannot even hear. So invalidation positive. So far, I've been focusing on this whole idea, the good news, increasing thought usage. Either because you feel good at the time or because there is some feelings of certainty that are misattributed to your thoughts. Both are possible. They combine forces most of the time, but they can be dissociated. But let's think about the other side of the coin. What happens when you don't feel good, or what happens when you are doubtful? Well, there is a relatively decrease in thought usage that may look like this. This is actually the shape of the two-way interaction that you saw before several times. So there is a relative attenuation of thought use, but still you can see the main effect of thought direction when you are doubtful. So sometimes you just doubt your thoughts and you don't use them as much, but they still carry the day. So positive thoughts are having a more positive impact than negative thoughts. But some of the times, you will see that the doubt is capable of canceling the impact of thoughts. So it doesn't matter whether you were having positive thoughts or negative thoughts to begin with, because you don't trust them, therefore you don't use them. So that is a different outcome. So doubt can attenuate, that would be the first case, or eliminates the impact of thoughts. Then you can find a reversal even. So you are so doubtful that you do the opposite of whatever you were planning on doing. So you can find one of these different outcomes. There are actually other outcomes, but these three are the most prototypical in our studies, and we are trying to predict a priori, make a priori predictions of when you are going to get one outcome or the other. And the candidates we are exploring right now is so the level of doubt. So when doubt becomes more extreme, maybe that is associated with less thought use, to the point that it doesn't matter what you think, or even you ended up doing the opposite thing. And that will be true also when your thoughts are framed in terms of white and black, all or nothing. So if you're in a cross trying to decide whether to go left or right, if you doubt your left, you will go right. So if you are thinking about the world in terms of all or nothing, white and black, dichotomous thinking instead of more continuous thinking. So if you think you're trying to decide whether you are smart or stupid, and that's how you frame the question, and then you have doubts about being smart, you only can conclude you are stupid. But if you are trying to decide how smart you are, how intelligent you are, then it's a more continuous framing, and then doubt will lead you to a lower response, but not to the other side. So trying to identify the factors that are playing a role there. I'm not going to talk about compensation because I think we saw that earlier today. So take home point number 4, which is like no process. Doesn't matter whether you are studying a low thinking process like classical conditioning or mere exposure, or you are dealing with a metacognitive process like this one that requires for you to have thoughts to begin with, and then have some perceptions of those thoughts. So that is a metacognitive process, and no process happens all the time for all people in all situations. Processes are more likely to operate under certain circumstances, and we've been trying to calibrate those moderating conditions, and the one that I'll highlight today is a mode of thinking. For metacognitive processes to occur, that is, for you to start thinking about your own thoughts, you need to be motivated and capable of engaging in evaluations of your thoughts. Therefore, you need to have thoughts to begin with, although technically that's not true, because the tip of the tongue, you are having thoughts about thoughts that you don't have at that time, but you think you had them in the past. So technically, you don't really need to have the initial thought there, but in most cases, you need to have thoughts, and then you start thinking about the perceived validity of those thoughts, whether those thoughts are the right ones to have, or whether I feel good about them, should I go with them? That requires thinking. High thinking conditions are associated with more validation processes. So here is an example of, again, another earlier study. We have people generating either positive thoughts, then they had to recall a time in which they were happy or sad. Happy is an emotion that is associated with both pleasantness and certainty, whereas sadness is usually on the other side of the continuum. And what you see is the self-validation outcome that you just saw several times is a two-way interaction. Only under high thinking conditions, but when there is cognitive load, you just see two main effects, one for each of the two inductions. We are able to replicate that kind of pattern with all kinds of paradigms, attitudes about, so pro-attitudes, these are attitudes about Ukrainian refugees and behaviors to mentor students at the University of Madrid, the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, and that is more likely to operate under self-validation metacognitive processes only for high thinking conditions. High thinking conditions is just personal relevance is high, distraction is low, so you care about things, you are able to process, there are no distractions, there are no other competing tasks that prevents you from engaging in thinking about your own thoughts. Again, we've done it a number of times. It's not only elaboration that is capable of moderating process. There are other potential variables as well, some of which are being studied. Again, compensatory threats are one that we heard this morning, but just being observed by others apparently disengage you from thinking about your metacognitions. That's research that we didn't do, but it's very cool. I think it's I don't know if it's a JPSP or a JP General. I think that's where it ended up being. And selfish. So when people are in a selfish mode, apparently they don't care about whether their thoughts are perceived to be right or not. They don't engage in usage of the calibration of those metacognitive perceptions. So those are other things. Okay. Point number 5. The outcome of those metacognitive processes are likely to vary with a number of features, one of which is whether your thoughts are positive or negative. You already saw that in all the samples I gave you, but there are other things as well. So this is one case in which having different thoughts is leading to different outcomes through this metacognitive process. But this is another case in which we found moderation, which is like if you manipulate when the validating induction is introduced, that makes a difference because it's likely going to change what kind of thought is chronically accessible by default in each of those places. So all the examples that you saw before is when you first have people generating thoughts, and then you do something to change the perceived validity of those thoughts. But if you reverse the order of induction, for example, if you make people feel good or feel powerful before generating thoughts, then the consequences will be in terms of processing, the subsequent processing, what thoughts you generate, and that will be because you trust whatever you had as a first thought coming to mind by default. So thoughts can be positive or negative, can be the thoughts that you generated in response to messages or inductions, or the thoughts that you chronically came to the lab with. Thoughts can be in one direction or another. Those were all the other examples, but they can be ambivalent. So that is an interesting case. You have people with both positive and negative thoughts, and then all of a sudden you do something for them to feel very good about their thoughts. And it turns out that you will magnify the ambivalence that those mixed thoughts are producing. So that is an interesting case. Again, if you just have positive thoughts and not all of a sudden you are sure, you do something good. You have negative thoughts, all of a sudden you feel good about your thoughts, you do something bad. But if you have both positive and negative thoughts at the same time, and then you feel sure, you don't do anything. You freeze, you paralyze. You don't know what to do because you are sure both of those things are right. So ironically, all these inductions, the confidence, self-affirmation, positive mood, they don't cure ambivalence. Ironically, they magnify the consequences of conflict. Another case here, I'm going to skip that one. So this is some of the things that we are doing right now. One paradoxical case is that one of the things that you can have confidence or doubt about is your own confidence or your own doubt. So ironically, if you have people generating all kinds of worries, fears, and doubts, and then you do something for them to doubt those doubts, then that doubt, initial doubt, is alleviated. So two inductions of the same variable, in this case doubt, instead of producing an average effect or a multiplying effect, no, it's interacting with each other. So now I'm doubtful of the initial doubts. I shouldn't care. I feel pretty sure. And we are trying to study whether that translates into consequential outcomes. So final idea is that even though I've been using examples of powerful postures or emotions or nodding and shaking, all those things are likely to come with a meaning by default. And for something to be associated with perceived validity and therefore to magnify the impact of whatever you have in mind, for that, the meaning by default has to be high in validity. It has to be something that makes you feel confident. But If you happen to be in a culture or in a country where nodding is associated with disagreement, then nodding will be associated with less thought use than shaking. So there is nothing about nodding, even though Darwin says that nodding is a positive behavior because it's associated with reaching the nipple when you have to get your food, and the satiation is removing your face, and those are predetermined to be associated. And in fact, most countries will associate this with agreement and this with disagreement, but most, but not all. So if you change the meaning of the behavior in this particular case, you will change whether that behavior is capable of validating or invalidating the thoughts. And we have reverse many of the effects that we try by manipulating what is the meaning that people have. Here's a case in which we have people writing positive or negative thoughts. This is a package that is focused on body image. So we have healthy diets, unhealthy diets. We have body image, all kinds of things. But in all the cases, we manipulate whether thoughts were positive or negative. And then we have participants writing those positive or negative thoughts, depending on condition. And what we changed here was what they did with the paper in which they wrote their thoughts. So when they put their thoughts, written thoughts, into a place that was associated with a safe location, whatever they wrote that is now in a safe location, they felt good about it and they use it more. Again, regardless of whether those were positive or negative thoughts. But in the other condition, we had them people break into pieces whatever they wrote and throw it in the garbage. Then it didn't matter whether the thoughts were positive or negative. They didn't use them. Now, those two actions by default have a meaning that is likely to be similar for most people. So when you put something in a pocket or in your purse, it's usually because it's something that you value. And when you throw something away in the garbage, it's because it's something you don't value. But those meanings by default can be changed, and that's what we did in a recent paper, PSPB. So you can move the thoughts to your pocket, but if you lead participants to think that instead of protecting the thoughts, the thoughts are becoming a secret, they are kept out of sight, they cannot be seen, those meanings are associated with low validity, therefore they don't use them anymore. So even though the same action can validate or invalidate the thoughts depending on the meaning that people are attributing to that action. Same thing for moving things to a box. If you think that is a garbage can, you don't use your thoughts, but if you think the box is actually a mail that is going to be shared with others, even though you are throwing your thoughts and you are putting distance, but if you think that is because you are reaching other people, that is a high validity meaning, and then you start using your thoughts. Again, so we replicated this a number of times. So we have people moving thoughts electronically, so they type their thoughts in the computer, and then the file is translated to different places in the hard drive, and depending on the label of the hard drive, you get more thought usage or less thought use as a function on the meaning of the location where you move those thoughts. So in this particular paper, so you write online reviews and then you send them to different places, and we manipulate whether those places where the destination of those thoughts are perceived to be high or low in validity. And this was the second leg of a prior PSPB that we did, not with the perceived destination of thoughts and with high and low validity of those locations, but with the perceived origin of the thoughts, whether you thought that the thoughts are coming from you or the thoughts are coming from the media, so the self or the environment. That changes whether you use your thoughts more or not, depending on whether you are high or low in self-esteem, and in the case of the self as the perceived origin of the thoughts, and depending on whether you like advertisement, in the case that the thoughts are produced by media. So it's not about the self, it's not about the destination, it's not about whether thoughts are generated by you or you perceive that you had agency of or any control on whether the thoughts come to mind or not. It's not about that. It's about the validity associated with those perceptions. So another thing that we have done with Spike Lee is the classic paradigm in which people wash their hands in order to get rid of their guilt. Yes, for most people, washing their hands or engaging in any cleansing procedure is associated with removing dirt. That's an invalidity action, which, by the way, we made the prediction that because it's an invalidity action, will not only reduce the impact of positive thoughts, but also will undermine the impact of positive thoughts. And they found that interaction. So washing your hands can alleviate guilt after a transgression, but also is less likely for people who have generated thoughts, and then you get into hygiene, and then you don't use those positive thoughts anymore. They don't have the same impact. So same action can be framed in this case as removing dirt, low validity, or as adding purity. You are washing your hands, and all of a sudden that is not removing dirt. It's adding purity. It's a high validity meaning. So even though you are washing your hands, now that is associated with more thought use. Again, more thought use will lead to polarization of positive thoughts and polarization of negative thoughts. So, in summary, by identifying this metacognitive process, that it sounds kind of complicated because you have to be thinking about your thoughts, and then whatever you perceive your thoughts to be in terms of valid or not, that can come from anywhere. Those variables can be individual, can be combined person and situation. It sounds complicated, but actually it's a well-calibrated process. We are able to make these three-way, four-way predictions a priori, and it works very well, has been replicated many times, many different labs that for which we play no role, still finding the same outcomes when they create the right circumstances. So this is a quite unique mental operation that was not part of the literature at the time, and so that has been an innovation that allowed us to discover a bunch of new effects, reinterpreting past findings, but with a different different mediator in this case, the different process that is capable of producing the same outcome, specifying the conditions and the measures that are more likely to be associated with the operation of metacognitive processes, establishing clear antecedents and consequences, distinguishing. This is very important for us because we were working with a bunch of other processes that are relevant for what we call primary cognition. So just having thoughts, having initial thoughts, and it makes a difference whether you have positive or negative thoughts, and it makes a big difference whether you have a lot of thoughts or not. High and low thinking, dual process models. So we already had a lot of work done, especially the ELM that Rich introduced, had a lot of processes, specifying 4 key processes capable of changing every single judgment for every single topic. But they were all about the thoughts people are having. So now we were able to introduce a new process, and for us the challenge, and then this is for those that are doctoral students that are starting, for the challenge was not only to break all the walls and with a new idea, but also to establish when you get this operation to be more likely to function, and when you get all the other mechanisms that we know are capable of producing outcomes that are relevant as well, when you get one or the other, specifying those conditions, antecedents and consequences, and moderating of outcome, moderating of process, and doing all of that with enough calibration to actually not only be able to produce results in your lab, but just to help others to make sense of their own research. That has been a long journey, but a very pleasant one that I feel very proud of. If you guys allow me to say that, don't feel like an imposter here. But pretty proud about this and the training I got both at University of Madrid and Ohio State. Great places to be for this kind of approach. So with all of that, I will tell you. Now, if we're going to make wise interventions in the domain of positive psychology, we need to pay attention to process. That's the take-home message. There is nothing more practical than a good theory. Well, nothing more practical than a very good theory. because you want to have more than one process in your theory in order to accomplish more than one thing at a time. It gets complicated if you have more than one process, but you cover more range of predictions. So if you are going into the applied route, please pay attention to the underlying process. Here, if we were not making distinctions between the content of the thoughts and the perceived validity of those thoughts, we will find flat results in all the studies. The interaction will disappear if you don't split by the right variables. So there is nothing more practical than a good theory. So just having people engage in positive thinking, that is not going to lead to positive outcomes half of the time. In fact, it's going to backfire. So, at least when they operate through this particular process. So, positive thinking is not enough. Positive emotions are not enough for people to improve their well-being. Positive variables, engaging in self-affirmation, gratitude, you name it, they are not enough. They produce what you think half of the time, but they lead to just the opposite finding the other half of the time when they operate through metacognitive processes. So it's very important to identify in what condition you are, not only for finding results, but to helping people. And another example that we, this is the last one, by the way. So when you have people in all these mindfulness courses, in which they contemplate the thoughts as they come and they don't judge them. You just put distance. Your thoughts are not you. You are not your thoughts. Disattach from your thoughts. Let all your thoughts go. Think your thoughts are just going away. Oh, that's great. Apparently, just by engaging in that metacognitive process is already good for you, because it puts you into some self-awareness, apparently, that is good per se. But all of that is only being associated with positive outcomes when it operates through metacognitive process, when the thoughts that you are separating from are negative. The last thing you want to do on a happy day is go to a mindfulness class. From his point of view. You're having all these positive thoughts, and all of a sudden they are just thoughts, they are not you. Just put distance with them. Well, then you don't use them. You're not happy anymore. You just ruin my day. So again, things a lot of interventions that are thought by default to help people that are suffering, and they work very well, and we are able to replicate those findings. But again, specifying that those benefits will be particularly present for the case of negative thoughts being invalidated or separated from the self. But if you're having all those positive thoughts, then it will backfire. So positive thoughts, positive emotions, positive variables, and positive interventions that are based on that distance can have one outcome or the opposite, depending on the process by which they operate and the conditions under which that particular process is more likely to operate. So thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. I think we have time for a couple of questions. No questions? You want to run away?
I think I will never go to a mindfulness class. I'm a happy person. But I wonder a little bit about one thing. I've been always intrigued by forgiveness and gratitude. Forgiveness is something you do in connection to something negative. Gratitude is something you do in connection to something positive. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for your theory? There's positive and there's negative, and there's an action. You try to get some positivity from it, I guess. So what is your advice? Because your practical advice was very good for mindfulness, but now for forgiveness and gratitude.
Thank you. Those were they're in purpose, because we've been collecting some studies with both of those variables. So one thing that is important is that when you express gratitude, most of the literature shows that you feel good. Express gratitude, it feels relief, it feels good, and there's good. Thanks, Cole. I express gratitude to you for the reminder. So it also takes some courage to express gratitude. So it's both a pleasant experience, but also a confident experience. Now, the idea here is that those positive feelings, that pleasantness that comes from expressing gratitude to another person or to another entity, you can express gratitude to God. And that pleasantness and that certainty that is associated with that variable is misattributed. Those feelings of certainty and pleasantness are now misattributed to whatever thought you had beforehand. So, for example, in this, which are unrelated to the person for which you are expressing the gratitude and are unrelated to the self. So in the case that we are working with Pat Carroll, another person from Ohio State, what we have is people generating positive or negative thoughts about genetically modified foods. And then they write a letter to express gratitude, or they write a letter on a different thing that serves as a control. And what we found is that expressing gratitude magnifies, polarizes, validates the thoughts that they were having beforehand about the food, even though are completely related events. That was the first idea. It's like something expressing gratitude is an important thing, but has nothing to do with genetically modified foods. It's just that if you were thinking about those thoughts, then now you trust those thoughts and you act on them, and they guide your attitudes and your behavioral intentions and your purchases, actually. So, again, it's not about whether it's nodding or shaking or it's expressing gratitude or forgiveness or something. It's like whatever you do, big, medium, or small, if it is associated with feeling good, has the possibility of validating thoughts that were unrelated to the task, but that were there to begin with. So you have people with positive and negative thoughts, then they feel good for whatever reason unrelated to the initial task. And now those thoughts are translated into judgment and action with more likelihood when you feel good, as it is the case for expressing gratitude and forgiveness. And the opposite will be true for when you engage in things that are associated with feeling bad.
But that applies to gratitude, but not so much to forgiveness. I can imagine for gratitude that you become, with a lot of additional thoughts that you may have, that you self-validate that it was rightfully so that you were that you expressed gratitude. But for forgiveness, it's something negative. And maybe people are a little bit doubtful about forgiveness as well.
Forgiveness is something negative, but it's associated with certainty, as it is the case with anger, helplessness, and other things. So to be 100% honest, we have run the studies with gratitude. The ones on forgiveness that are with the new student in the lab, Irina, sitting over there. But the prediction is that forgiveness has been, at least in the literature, has been associated with power. So would you forgive? I forgive your life because I'm in a position in which I can forgive you. And that reminds me that I'm the one in power. If we are capable of isolating that component, we will find cognitive validation. If forgiveness is associated with unpleasantness and we isolate that, then it will lead to invalidation. So for things like expressing gratitude, if you will, yes, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Expressing gratitude means that at some point you need help, which is not very confident if you need help from another person. So if people focus on that part of gratitude, then gratitude will be associated with invalidation. Now, regardless of appraisal, if you feel uncomfortable because of your personality or your culture with forgiveness, or with gratitude. Imagine, because you are anti-religious and you think those are Christian terms. You don't like those things. You think they are for weak people that need God to come and save them. If that's what you think, they will be associated with invalidation and with reducing thought use. So by default, we think that most of the literature is showing that they are associated with pleasantness and with certainty. Sure, more in the case of gratitude than certainty. Certainty is a little bit more complex, but you can isolate the confidence that is associated with forgiveness through power. And if you do that, then whatever you happen to have in mind beforehand will be magnified, will translate into action. At least that's, again, this is very important to emphasize it one more time. At least when gratitude and forgiveness follow the generation of thinking and are operating under the conditions that we are able to specify. I don't think that most people go through life on a daily basis engaging in metacognitive processes by default. That's something that it takes an extra step. Therefore, it is reserved for conditions of high thinking and that particular order of events. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for the talk. I'm fascinated about the idea that some posture is giving some validity to some thought, but like I'm a classical social psychologist, I all the time thinking, what about the group, like the source of the validity? Then, because I used to teach my students that they will think that some thought is okay if the reference group thinks that this group is okay. This thought is okay. Then, what do you think will be more powerful? The body posture or the group, the reference group? Have you tried to design some experiment in order to see if this movement that is real, that I use it in the classroom and is effective, will be exactly so powerful with a cognition that is related to the social conflict to other one that is not?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. I think there are several questions embedded in that idea. So yes, you can find validation by things that are beyond the person and they relate to the group. In fact, Javier Orcajo, that is sitting there, has done a lot of work on majority and minority influence as sources of thought validation. So the greater the numerical status of this of the source, the more consensus, the more likely it is for people to use their thoughts. We know that when you are performing a behavior in company of others, so there is synchrony with others, that can actually enhance even further the validating impact of the behavior. But as a classic psychology, I'll give you an example of embodiment in classical conditioning. Some of the early work on environment, because the body, physical postures and physical movements are part of the physical nature. Most of the initial processes that were used to understand and to explain environment were low thinking processes, being the dominant one, classical conditioning. So our dear John Cacioppo had some pioneer studies in which people were using different muscles in their arms, extension and flexion. So these muscles that go into attracting things to you are associated with more positive evaluation than the muscles that go into rejecting, as it is the case with head nodding and head shaking. And they were interpreted in terms of the outcome, the positive outcome of extension versus flexion, nodding versus shaking. Those were, at the time, only interpreted as cases of low thinking processes like classical conditioning operating. Then, there was some work saying that, no, maybe you are just biasing the thoughts that come to mind with these muscles or with these movements. So that's another possibility. So it's not only that there is a simple association that doesn't require thinking. Maybe you engage in thinking, but that thinking is colored by the body. So the body is capable of changing the content of the thoughts, But this is the ultimate, it's the most recent. So it's the ultimate case in which the physical body is capable of, and I'm going to be precise about the words, is the physical body is not only not reducing thinking, is not changing what you think, but is capable, your physical body is capable of multiplying the impact of your thoughts. So which is the kind of like the opposite message that the literature from objectification often makes, a trade-off between body and mind. And when it happens through this process, the predictions are completely the opposite. So the body doesn't have to prevent people from using their mind. In fact, some body actions are associated with even more thought usage.
Maybe the last one, just in case we can order food for dinner. As you want.
So thank you very much to include this mindfulness construct and processes, because I think it's very fashionable now, like a construct. I'm not totally agree with you when you say that in a mindfulness classroom, what you teach is that you are not your thoughts. Maybe we could change this sentence in you are not only your thoughts. I totally agree with you that the worst thing you can do is to bring a very happy person to a mindfulness classroom. But I would like to emphasize that what we learn in a meditation, not only mindfulness, but a religious or not religious meditation process, is to learn to accept and not to react to your metacognitive processes. So my question to you is, what about if you include in your theory what happened after a mindfulness courses in this metacognition you have included in your theory? Do you think that could change a little bit? Just having more notion and more consciousness of what you react and of what you accept of your thought, of your feelings, and so on?
Well, thanks a lot for your answer. For your question, not your answer. So you need to agree with me, and also I really like mindfulness. So, as I do like a lot positive psychology. So the message here is that by some of the work that is done with these variables is sometimes it's a theoretical from the point of view of the processes that are involved. And by paying attention to the process, you actually can gain even further calibration to identify who can benefit the most. So that is the take-home message. Is not trying to gain popularity by saying controversial statements. So I like mindfulness, I like positive psychology, and I just think that we can do more with it by gaining an understanding of the processes that are involved. And again, in many of these variables, some of the literature only contemplate processes that are based on low thinking. And when it comes to thinking, they only focus on the direction and the amount. And what I'm trying to say is that it's not only that, all of those are true, and we know when they are more likely to operate, but you also need to make room for this possibility as one more thing. And it happens in some situations and for some people more often than for others. So again, by knowing, by getting more precise about the process and by not forgetting the measures that need to be taken for those processes to be assessed, then we can get even more positive and better outcomes. I think the question you were asking is like, well, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, the thought that you have in mind, what is it going to happen when you engage in this contemplation of your thoughts, not judging your thoughts? It doesn't matter whether you call it disattachment or diffusion, is another term that people use here. There is a big review with all the terms. This is going to sound self-promotion, but here is all the terms that people use for these ideas is validation of thought, separation, diffusion, disattachment, distance, dissociation, non-evaluative, contemplation, visual perspective, mindfulness, the thought cleansing, mental hygiene. It goes on and on and on and on. We wrote a review on these different terms. Some of them, they mean the same. Some of them mean very different things. But the idea is like, well, if you engage in these metacognitive processes, do you ended up gaining some consciousness? That's I think the word that you use. And we have not done any work on that. But I read as much as people thinking that not only you gain more consciousness, but then you may actually even connect with other consciousness. Yep. I don't know whether you go to a morphic field or the universe is coming to you. I don't know what it is. We haven't done any research, but apparently, if you do this enough, you not only gain some perspective on your own thoughts, and not only you start feeling more conscious, but then you may become more open or more sensitive to other kinds of thoughts, perhaps. Again, I know some people advocate for that. Our research doesn't speak to that, but it's quite an interesting idea that they call it awakening consciousness. And of course, not only that, but you feel more authentic and a bunch of things. It's just so apparently, even though in the short term, by putting distance with positive thoughts, may not lead those positive thoughts to become a reality, which will be a tiny lose. But maybe by engaging in metacognition over time, even though you are putting distance on both positive and negative thoughts, so that you are attenuating the relative impact, but maybe you gain something at the end of the day or at the end of the decade. That we don't know yet. I don't know yet, but apparently the ones that practice this more, they say that if anything happened, it would be something along these lines.
Well, what a good ending. Paranormal activity into the room. Wow. I never expect that, to be honest. I think that's all. Well, I want to make, I want to give you the take-home messages that I've seen in a humorous look. Always I'm trying to make jokes to have a good atmosphere. Basically, what I learned today is that for improving your research, you have to talk to terrorists. They know about research a lot. If you want to persuade someone, you need to take care about what they say, probably with a confident gesture and posture. What else? That making an international conference with people from all over the world is bad for our environment, but good for our intellectual stimulation, at least. Yeah. And something more that probably some of the conspiracy theory must be right. Not all of them, but at least one probably has to be right, for sure. Pretty sure that. So we are going to finish with the message of Pablo of just forget about all the negative things that happened today in relation to the seminar. Keep the positive and see you tomorrow. Okay? Bye.